Jeremy, good morning to you. It's always a pleasure speaking with you here on Live Now from Fox.
Good morning, Gina. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thank you for asking. Jeremy, truly hard for me to speak on seeing that unfold. We saw the footage with our content partners over at Fox 11 LA, people getting hit with bats and speakers, throwing fireworks at one another. Seeing that happen, it took me back to the civil rights movement when you were seeing people being water hosed, milk being thrown on people. Break this down for us, because that one phrase that's been thrown around throughout all of this is, well, it's my First Amendment right. Didn't know it was a First Amendment right to throw a speaker at someone.
No, there's not. There's two important overriding concepts here. The first is that conduct is not speech. The First Amendment is very clear that people have the right to peaceably assemble. Throwing things, hitting people, breaking windows, vandalizing things, that's not speech. That's conduct, and conduct can be criminalized. Murder is conduct. Driving while intoxicated, that's conduct. The government can absolutely criminalize conduct, and a lot of those things are assault, and that's not peaceable assembly. That's very clear cut. What I think a lot of people are missing too is what's called a time, manner, and place analysis. So when we break down the First Amendment, what we say is, look, the town square is what is traditionally protected, right? If city council is meeting and they're doing it on the town square, you have the right to assemble. You're going to have a lot of First Amendment protections if you're on your bullhorn. But if you're at the mayor's house at 2 a.m. on your bullhorn, that's a big problem. And the university is going to kind of fall somewhere in the middle of that, because is a university a place for free speech and ideas? Okay, sure, you can make that argument. You're also doing classes. You're also a housing facility because you're a dormitory, and you're somewhat of an apartment complex because you're keeping people safe. You're feeding people, and on some level, you're doing sanitation. You have to get a permit to have a parade in cities. You don't have the right to block streets, and you don't have the right to do a lot of that conduct. So that's why a lot of what you're seeing and what we're hearing is just not protected by the First Amendment.
Jeremy, I know a concern with this particular protest was that it took a minute for authorities to arrive there on the scene, and knowing that lives were at stake. Break that down for us. We heard from House Speaker Mike Johnson days ago there on the steps of Columbia University. And just to kind of wrap up what he was saying, it's embarrassing. He says, you send your children to school to get an education. It's finals week, and instead of them learning, they're out doing this. Of course, I'm sure it's okay if it was just, out there being respectful, with your signs and, sharing your viewpoints. But when it's hate speech, when it's turning violent, that's the concern.
The violence is the concern, and the Supreme Court would use the language "a true threat," right? And we want to make clear too. Look, the First Amendment doesn't care which flag you're flying. It doesn't care necessarily about your point of view. And I don't think that anybody who is coming out and saying, look, this thing has got to be under control, is saying anything about one side versus the other. And the other part of this too is, and let's be just honest and frank about it, a good protest, the whole point of it is to push the boundaries, isn't it? Hitting bats, hitting people with bats, throwing milk, in a camped a tent city, that goes beyond that, and that clearly violates laws and safety and things like that. We can debate what is hate speech and what is not hate speech, but when there's a true threat, that's what's criminalized, right? And again, talking about the First Amendment and the First Amendment not being absolute, we talk about you don't have the right to go into a crowded theater and yell fire. So when we talk about these things, there are lines and there are boundaries that really are going to be criminal. Now, at the University of Texas in Austin, there was a lot of people that were arrested in the last couple of days. The district attorney's office turned around and said, well, we're not going to prosecute those. And that's fine. Everybody gets what they want, kind of, and nobody gets what they want, kind of. And everybody hopefully goes home and is safe. But obviously, a lot of these protests, everything seems to be an accelerant to this fire. And we're just going to have to see how long it all rages. But from a legal standpoint, if your conduct breaks the law, or you are making a true threat to somebody else, then you can be arrested, and that arrest might unfortunately stick.
Jeremy, I'm so glad you brought that up. That actually segues into the next part of this interview I wanted to get into. So I changed the video on the screen to video from overnight, where we saw that hundreds of people were arrested there on the campus of Columbia University. And when we talk about these arrests and potential charges, you have people that basically barricaded themselves inside of a room on the campus. And we've even seen arrests when people block off major streets. You know, if law enforcement, first responders need to get to someone who's having a heart attack, they can't because those roadways are being blocked. Then, as we mentioned, you know, with some of these protests, officers have been hit and spit upon. What are some of these charges that protesters can face while they think they're only doing their First Amendment rights?
It's really going to be fact dependent. Most of these charges are going to be misdemeanors. What police officers are trained to do in crowd control situations is they're trained to single people out. They're trained to say, you know, when the bar is closing and it's 2 a.m, not that we know anything about that, and people get rowdy and people kind of start getting loud, right? No protests. Police are sort of trained to go after an individual here and an individual there, and that will kind of quiet the crowd. More often than not, those are going to be misdemeanor offenses, right? Not it's going to be a trespassing type offense, or it's going to be a public intoxication type offense. Not that that's not that public intoxication was what's happening here. It could be disregarding a police officer. It could be some type of evading arrest on foot, which is going to be a misdemeanor. The police are probably in some instances just kind of looking for reasons to make an arrest. And there's a saying in criminal law: you may beat the rat, but you're not going to beat the ride, which is just a nice way of saying, look, you may win this thing in court, but you're going to jail today, and that's gonna break this up. Now, unfortunately, what you're describing too is hitting somebody with a baseball bat's a felony any state of the union. So that person is potentially going to have, or those people potentially going to have legal problems for the rest of their life, as well they should, because I mean, you could kill somebody with that type of conduct. So depending on what's going on, the severity of the charges can really vary.
And Jeremy, as we paint this picture, I want to ask you, you know, when these protests turn violent, what good does that do? Does it take away from the crux and the real reason the protests are happening anyway? I mean, if you're trying to promote peace in a certain area of the world and then you're taking part in a violent protest, it seems counteractive.
You would think so. I mean, again, this is not. You can't debate with a mob, right? And the mob doesn't really think, or a mob thinks like a mob thinks. So there's not people kind of lose control in those situations and circumstances. A protest by nature it pushes a boundary, right? They don't get the attention that they seek unless those lines are pushed. I mean, and which is sort of the tragic part of all this. But when it turns into a riot, that's just not protesting. And yes, I would think that reflects very poorly on the folks that you're with, and it reflects very poorly on your cause. And I would think even the leaders of that would sort of say that this is Frankenstein's monster. I'm sure the protests, I'm sure the sentiments are born out of sincerity, but when you start adding people and you start adding all these folks to it, Frankenstein's monster gets out of control and stomps through the entire village. The creators have lost control of it. That's why it's a mob. And yes, the whole message, I think, can very much get lost, even though, again, a good protest pushes the boundaries. That's what gets you and I talking about it. But this I don't think anybody thinks this is a good thing.
Well, Jeremy, I truly appreciate your candidness, as I love to have these raw and unfiltered conversations with you. Is there anything else you'd like to add? Also, I guess some of the protesters in jail this morning, maybe they're watching live now from Fox. Do they have a case? Can they potentially get out? Can they potentially get charges that might be filed against them? Getting off the record?
Maybe, but probably the First Amendment's not going to be the way they do it. I think the way that if I'm representing somebody who's charged with one of these things, again, it's going to be really fact dependent. And I think that hopefully I'm dealing with the prosecutor on the other end who understands that this might be some youthful exuberance, that this might be that I was singled out for the purposes of crowd control. Again, the police are they're dealing with a big crowd of people, and even your really well armed police guard, they're going to have 5, 10, 15 people in their riot gear. They're facing 100 people. That's pretty scary for them. So I think that your defense is probably going to be there. But again, the time, the manner, the place of the protest, that's what's going to get you protected. In a university, it's just not the town square. It's somewhere in the middle. So I don't know that if there's a protection there, I don't know that it's a First Amendment one.
Jeremy, again, truly a pleasure speaking with you this morning here on Live Now from Fox. I'm sure it won't be the last time. You enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.